Hi, everyone. This is week one of our COVID-19 pivot to virtual learning at SNU. And this is the World Civ class. And thank you all for turning in your questions to me so that I can create a little bit of a mini lecture to answer your key questions. I really hope that you are actually asking questions that you're curious about because it doesn't do any good if you're just kind of throwing a question out there just for the sake of doing it, but really ask the questions that you're curious about, because I'm going to take them seriously and I'm going to try to answer as many as I can. So I got about 15 or 16 questions on the topic of Athenian democracy today. And so I want to sort of talk a little bit about representative government, about leadership, and about what democracy today, but also ancient democracy, says about us as human beings and about how we can conduct ourselves in the world. And so to start off, I want us to think a little bit about what it means to be a human being. And so humans from very early times are social creatures. We have these really big brains that give us access to a tool called language. And as a result, we're able to communicate with one another. We're able to also imagine realities that don't exist currently. And through communication, perhaps organize ourselves in ways that allow us to bring about a reality that hasn't existed previously. And so language is this very, very powerful tool that allows one person to talk with other people and to amass the energy or focus the energy of a lot of different people onto a particular task. And so I think democracy in some ways, or at least participatory government, emerges out of that toolkit. Essentially, people suggesting that there's a way of doing things that are that might be better than the current state of existence, and then attracting people to that idea, and then getting other people to suggest what that new reality might also look like, and then organizing the tasks involved to create that reality, and then going to work on it, and then checking in periodically to make sure that people are aligned, going in the right direction, that everybody still agrees that this is a good thing, and that everybody's still willing to commit themselves to the work involved in creating a better world, or at least a world that's different than the very current one. Certainly, as we live today, we have this very complex civilization, this very sophisticated civilization with lots and lots of people in it. And so it's very difficult to communicate with everyone and for everybody's voice to be heard. And so we do things through representative forms of government, and sometimes through not very representative forms of government. I'm going to argue that democracy is an extension of a tribal kind of society in the ancient period, the period that we're talking about. And so what we have are these tribes, which are family groups that have amassed a pretty sizable population through time, maybe 2 or 3 or 400, maybe then 2 or 3 or 1,000, maybe up to 10,000 people might identify themselves as being the successors or the offspring or the descendants of some particular patriarch or some particular group of people at an earlier time. And they probably share a lot of cultural characteristics. Some of those cultural characteristics may be things like language, maybe things like a similar religion, maybe things like sort of a common heritage, looking back through time and thinking about their ancestors, their founding fathers or founding mothers, or the gods of their city, or something like that. In the 19th century, 200 years ago, 150 years ago or so, scholars talked about that in terms of the development of something called nationalism, where people are organizing themselves around culture. And that's an expression of that tribalism. And so what I want you to imagine, what I want you to sort of think about when we think about democracy, is that you have a group of people who live in a particular geographical area, in a community. Maybe the center of that community is a city, and then it's got the surrounding agricultural lands, and so it would become a city state in that sense. And the people who live there are trying to figure out how to live in the best possible way that they can. And they've got to organize themselves, organize their resources, organize agriculture or fishing or mining or any other thing that they're doing economically. And one of the ways that they do that is they talk about what should be done, and they talk about it together. One thing that is true about human beings is that we have these really big brains, and they're supercomputers, but they're limited. We can only know so much. We talked about that earlier in the semester. But when we began to link up with other people, join up with them, talk about things, other people have different perspectives. They have different awarenesses. They recognize that there might be dangers that we don't even see, or they recognize that there might be opportunities that we're not even aware of. And so when we talk to one another about those things, those new awarenesses give us, a more sophisticated or a more complex understanding of the world and its possibilities. And so think about these people sitting around, maybe in the evening or early in the morning, and talking about what needs to be done in order to, get enough food, or get the resources that they need to be able to trade, or to worry about another group of people encroaching on their resources. And so they begin to think those things through. They begin to imagine the focus of their work for the day, for the week, for the month, for the year. And some people emerge as people with good ideas, or people who are charismatic and can convince a lot of people. And those become natural leaders. And so people look to them for their leadership. And those might be leaders in some sort of specialty too, like the really, really good wise farmer, or the really, really good musician or priest, or whatever it might be. And those natural leaders then are looked to as being sort of wise guides to the society. Well, when we get that in place, it becomes then sort of obvious, I think, that communication and the collaboration lead to then these proto-democracies. And I think that's what we're seeing in the historical record. So in your Cole and Ortega, the Thinking Past text, one of the things that they talk about is that we see these political organizations in places like Phoenicia, on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, that land that we've talked about in terms of being Canaan, or the land that the Hebrews move into out of Mesopotamia. Those authors also talk about the origins of these proto-democracies inside of Mesopotamia as well, these city-states that form up along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They talk about the tribal democracies, the assemblies of people who come together and discuss hard problems among the various tribal groupings in Africa. And we have evidence of that certainly all the way up into the modern period, where different tribal groups come together. They have an assembly. All of the adults in society then begin to discuss matters, and they make decisions in this sort of very collaborative way. I think we see this, as Cole and Ortega talk about, in little bits and pieces of fragments of evidence that we find in Vedic literature, the ancient South Asian Indian literature. And we see that talked about by the Greeks themselves, with the work that comes back, or the literature that comes back, or the stories that come back from Alexander the Great's army as it marches to India. And yet in Western civilization, we've really pointed to Athens as being that location, or that place where a democracy emerges in the West. And so while that's probably not true, I think one of the things that we can say about Athenian democracy is that it's less organic than some of the others. It's less natural, because it emerges out of the work of Cleisthenes and his reforms, where he says, we've got this area, we've got this city, but it's divided into different tribes, into different groups of people. And so there are probably about 5 or 6 probably natural tribes, people who live along the coast and participate in fishing, people that live in the uplands and participate in agriculture, maybe even herding, people who live in the city itself and are merchants. And Cleisthenes recognizes that those different groups of people have different interests. And if they just simply pursue their own self-interest as a community, they're divided from one another. Merchants have a different interest than people who are fishermen, than people who are herders, than people who are farmers. And so he needed a way, or he imagined a way, might be a better way to put it, to organize those people into these tribes that cut across these sort of economic tribal boundaries, or these maybe even these sort of cultural boundaries. And then he organized a political system where there were groups of representatives who came to a council of 500 representing each of the 10 tribes that he designed. And so I want you to note here that the big distinction for this Athenian government, which we have a lot of evidence for because a lot of it's written down and the documents are kept as a part of the heritage of Western civilization. But this thing that he creates is contrived. It's artificial. It doesn't emerge exactly naturally. And I think that's the real distinction here. What it really suggests is that government and political systems can be made up in some ways, and they have a good chance of working. And we see that working for the Athenians over time. So what would I say? I would say, number one, democracy or participatory government is something that humans just do naturally. But humans can also tweak it or design it in particular ways so that it can be perhaps better than, or more inclusive of, or more representative of a larger group of people. And I think we see evidence of that in the work that Cleisthenes is doing in Athens. That's not to say that other civilizations didn't do much of that same thing. What it does say is that we have good evidence for Cleisthenes doing that. Could the leaders of these village cultures in the Vedic tradition of India have been doing the same thing? Sure, they could have. And as we get larger and larger groups of people involved, there has to be some organization put to it, and the organizations are designed. So a few questions that also came out of the questions that you had, and I just want to kind of glance at these right quick. There was questions about citizenship. So who gets to be a citizen? And I think that you could see that in sort of these natural or organic democracies, citizenship is extended to all the people who are recognized as being members of the tribe. And that's kind of a tricky issue. So it could be that citizenship comes from this tribal membership that's based on family relationships. And so maybe slaves don't participate in those kinds of full belonging or full recognition to the tribe. But in some tribes, they do. And so that's something to be aware of. It's not a hard and fast rule. It really is local culture determining who its membership is. In history, we see ethnicity, or that blood relationship, as being an important determiner of citizenship. But we also see that citizenship can be constrained to a smaller group of people. For instance, those who are property holders, or those who are of particular occupations, or something like that. We also may see that notion of citizenship can be expanded to a broader group of people too. And we see that even in like modern democracy in the United States, where we have a lot of different ethnic groups who come and participate in society. And we extend the vote or suffrage to lots of different groups of people. And we do that really, we have some definitions for how one gets to be a citizen, but then we also say, we expect, as part of one's civic duty, to participate in society in a variety of ways, through things like voting, through things like paying taxes, participating in civic life. And we don't have good rules for that necessarily, but we have expectations. And other societies have, very strict expectations about that if you are a citizen, then you are required to vote. You are, by law, or you are required to pay taxes. And one of the tensions that we have in our own society today is the tension of, what do we do with people who don't meet the technical specifications for citizenship, but who participate in society by doing things like working and contributing to society. People who are, we would call them undocumented aliens, for instance. Undocumented aliens is oftentimes the term we use. And these are people who may be working hard, being paid under the table. Their employers may be exploiting them or cheating the tax system or a variety of things there. And really, our problem becomes, what do we do about that? Are these people who are participating in society really citizens because they're participating? Or are we going to constrain it back to a much more older thing and talk about it in terms of ethnicity, which is one of those conversations that are in the community? Are we going to say it's only for property owners or something like that? That's been old ways of thinking about citizenship. What are we going to do about it now? That's a question that we have to address as a society. So that's kind of meaningful to us as we think about citizenship. There were other questions about, the role of religion and participatory government. And I think that many of you saw, as you read the section on Mesopotamia, that the authors emphasized the idea that, cities in Mesopotamia were seen as the property of the gods, and usually one particular god. So each city had its patron god. This was also true in Greece as well, and other parts of the world. The people who lived in the city then were the subjects of the god. They were the people who were protected by the god, the worshipers of the god. And so there's this kind of interesting thing involved here. Like, can a god be a god if there are no worshipers? If nobody worships the god, is it really a god? And probably the answer is not really. And if that's the case, then the god has to figure out a way to protect the people, the worshipers who worship him or her, and in so doing, then cause people or give people a reason to do worship, to worship the god. In the same way, the king in many of those city-states was seen as a steward of the people who governed them in place of the god, because the god was invisible or not present. And so the steward, the king, took care of that. And in the same way, the purpose of the king was to make sure that the people were protected, that the will of the god was done on earth in such a way that it was good for people, good for society, that the god's protection would be manifested through the work of the king. In the same way that probably the god doesn't exist without worshipers, also the leader or the king can't exist really without followers. The Republican Speaker of the House some years ago, a fellow by the name of John Boehner, made this interesting little observation. He said, a leader without followers is simply a man on a walk. I thought that was kind of interesting. Leaders are made by the permission of their followers. And so these kings may have a certain kind of authority. They may have seen themselves as representing the god, having the power of God behind them. But, if people essentially quit giving permission, if people simply walked away, then all of a sudden that king's not really a king anymore. I mean, if he has no subjects. And so there has to be a back and forth in any kind of political system where the people are willing to continue to contribute to participating in the political system, whether it's by vote or participating in the economy or participating in following orders or following guidelines. If people are unwilling to do that, then the political system fails ultimately. And so every form of government requires some sort of participation. And what democracy does is it requires high levels of participation, or at least calls for or asks for really high levels of participation from the citizens. And so I think that's worth considering. And so the relationship between the gods, kings representing the gods, and the people really depend upon the people being willing to follow. I think also were some questions related um, to maybe we would call it the efficiency of democracy. So there were a few questions about, well, why did people just not follow one person as opposed to wanting to have decision making done in a group? Because groups are kind of inefficient sometimes, and I would say that that's probably true. Um, Tyranny, the rule of one person through some kind of absolute power, or through the representation of a very small group of people, oligarchy, we might call that, can be very efficient. However, it oftentimes is not very effective in the long run. Why? Because there are just a real limitation on perspective and on the ability to think through complicated problems by one or just a very small group of individuals. The more people you involve, the more difficult it is to do things quickly, perhaps, but the greater opportunity one has to listen for and create a sense of belonging, and then focusing the energy or harnessing the energy of a larger group of people on task. And I think that's important. There's a little saying that it's easy to stop one person. It's much more difficult to stop 100 people. There's also a little sort of bit of wisdom out there that people tend to embrace and work for things that they have created or the things that they have helped create. And so when you involve a lot of people in creating something or making a decision, then they're much more on board with that decision and willing to work for it and less willing to work against it. They grant permission to continue to do that work when they've created it for themselves. And so, natural leadership versus authority then is based on that idea that leaders emerge from the will of the people, as opposed to leaders impose their will on the people. We see examples of that in history. We see a lot of examples of that in history. But I think what we might suggest is that really effective leaders are harnessing the will and the power of a great number of people. And sometimes they create that will through charisma, through public debate, those sorts of things, and can have a lot of power for themselves. But when the people walk away from it, the leader's left fairly powerless, and that's something to recognize. So, what does this all mean? I've suggested a few things here, and I want to kind of summarize it. Um, Definition of democracy. Democracy is when people choose the course of society together and they authorize or they grant permission for certain leaders to make decisions that focus resources and organize people to accomplish that shared cause or that shared aligned task. Accountability in democracy for those leaders comes through people voting, people engaging in a debate over whether this is the very best course of action, and making a decision about whether or not this leader should continue to occupy a particular position of authority. So that's important. Um, Tyranny may be efficient, but democracy, if its various dependencies are met, can be more effective. And that goes back to that. It's easier to stop one person than it is 100. But I want to mention those dependencies just for a minute. Democracy is dependent upon people being able to freely express their perspective, their opinion, and then freely debate the merits of one another's opinion. So if you have a situation where people cannot express their opinion, or in a situation where nobody's willing to actually push back and say, I don't think that's right exactly. Like, let's look at it from this different perspective and really explore through debate the merits of particular perspectives, then democracy is not going to flourish. And that's one of the reasons that in college, professors like to encourage discussion, and really they want to encourage debate. They want you to step up and say, my opinion is this, and here are the reasons why. And then to have somebody else be able to say, I don't agree with you about that. I really think it's this way, and here are my reasons. And then for people to really grapple and be able to say, well, I can kind of see your point there, and yeah, I have a weakness here, but here's how I'm going to strengthen that. Here's how I'm going to maybe take a little different position and evolve or develop those new ideas. Democracy depends upon that. And if you're not practiced in debating and not getting your feelings hurt and kind of putting the issue out there and really struggling with the issue, then you're not going to be a good participant in democracy. And our democracy will fail. And you won't have the opportunity to sort of contribute to developing the course of society, the one that's going to benefit you and the people like you in society. So we've got to be able to do public debate, express our opinions, grapple with those things, disagree with one another. That's important. That's fundamental to democracy, and particularly to American democracy. And we're struggling with that right now. So how do we address that? One of the other dependencies of democracy is the protection of human rights. So if human beings, we would say, have certain kinds of rights. In the Declaration of Independence in the United States, we talk about those rights as the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We say that those are inalienable rights, and that they exist for every single human being. If you can take away the right to a person's life without recourse, without any sort of moral stop, you can't do that without people standing up and saying, wait a minute, it's only in very special circumstances that you can kill someone, that you can take their life away, that you can strip them of their property, that you can prevent them from pursuing their own interests. When you do that, then you take away people's ability to fully participate in public debate. If you can just kill your enemies and therefore eliminate their perspective, then you're not going to be able to have a democracy, because that's another part of human beings. Human beings tend to also want to amass power to themselves by eradicating those who disagree with them, or force people to agree with them in a particular perspective through fear. And so the protection of human rights is important to the maintenance of a democratic society. And finally, one of the other dependencies is the rule of law, that there are various and sundry ways of doing things, and we've codified them in law, and everybody has to follow them. Nobody's above the law. Nobody can go beyond the law simply because they have power. If you don't have the rule of law in society, it's hard to maintain democracy. Then it's easy to develop tyranny, dictatorship, and those kinds of things. And one of the principles that we have in American democracy, and really I think democracy in the larger context, is that people have to be able to participate in order to buy in and give permission to the leadership. And so we've got to support those rule of law, protection of human rights, and the freedom to debate perspectives openly in society if we have any hope for our own ability to participate in shaping the course of our own destiny. I want to say maybe a couple of other things very briefly. One is, you are followers and you are leaders. There are people who look to you to lead, and you have an obligation to follow those that you grant permission to lead you. You don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers. There's no one person who has all the answers and who can make perfect decisions all the time. We all need each other. I need to hear from you. You need to hear from me. We need to engage in that public debate. We need to talk about ideas. We need to develop a kind of consensus or an alignment about where we want to go with our society. If we're not both leaders and followers, it's tough. We have the power through our public conversations to create opportunities for more wisdom to emerge, because we can get different perspectives, hear different people's perspectives, and we've got to cultivate our ability to listen clearly to other people and really understand where they're coming from, to empathize with them, and to get into their shoes. And once we do that, we can make way better decisions than we could make if all we were doing was taking our own perspective and trying to force it on other people. And so, to do unto others as we would have done unto ourselves, that sort of golden rule, means we wouldn't want people to essentially tell us what to do and not give us the ability to express ourselves, not listen to us. And so it's incumbent upon us to listen to others, to embrace them, to include them, to bring them into the community, and to develop wisdom together about the direction we need to go, the solutions to the problems that we're trying to solve. And then when some things work, celebrate it. And when some things fail, figure out how to fix it. Go forward again, get everybody involved, lay it out there. Here's the problem. What do we need to do about it? And have that public debate, that conversation, and then regroup and go forward and try to solve the problem again. That's fundamental to small democracies, that tribal democracy, that group of people in our own society that we just bring together at small scale. It's also important, though more difficult to do, but certainly important to be able to do that on a large scale as well. And that's where representation comes in. And finally, the last thing I want to say is that people support what they help create. And that's where democracy has its power. People support what they help create. And so when we give people an opportunity to co-create with us, then they become people who are supporting that common direction that we've determined for ourselves. And so we have to provide that opportunity. If we don't provide that opportunity, we're losing out on wisdom. We're losing out on the commitment and the resources and the passion and the power that every human being possesses and can bring forth. And instead, what we'll get is a bunch of people who fold their arms and say, yeah, we'll see. And really, nothing can be done in that situation, because what those people have done is they have chosen to withhold permission for someone to actually lead. And when you withhold permission and you bring it to yourself, you're not going to give. And so just remember this as leaders, because you are leaders. As leaders, recognize this: people support what they help create. It's more difficult to stop 100 people than it is to stop one. And so if you want to be an effective leader, then one of the things I want you to be aware of is that you become powerful as more and more people permit you to lead them. And the only way you do that is by being a good steward of their time, of their energy, and you act on behalf of their well-being and on behalf of the shared vision that you've created together. So go and lead, go and follow, and be aware of these fundamental developments through human history that have led to the creation of this thing that we call democracy. So I hope you have a good rest of the week. I hope this was informative. I hope that maybe I've given you some good things to think about and maybe some things to act upon.